Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar from Emergency Response to Resilience, Future-Proof City Region Food Systems. My name is Guido Santini. I'm an FAO officer and coordinator of the City Region Food System program. And I would like to remind you that the interpretation is provided in French, Spanish, and Chinese. Please access the interpretation via the globe at the bottom of the screen and select your language. Please use the Q&A box to post your questions and not the chat box. This is the third webinar of a new Making Cities Resilient 2030 series focused on building resilient urban systems, an initiative from the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. In this case, the webinar is organized by the Food and Agriculture Organization. This is indeed, at the same time, the second of the FAO Knowledge Exchange webinar series on city region food systems. Today, we will focus on the experiences of cities around the world in implementing food system resilience in response to multiple shocks and stresses. Last week, member states and other stakeholders, including local governments, convened at the UN General Assembly for a high-level meeting on the midterm review of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. The meeting adopted a political declaration calling for much greater action to strengthen disaster resilience in every decision, action, and investment. Scaling up climate and disaster risk reduction at the local level is why UNDRR launched the Making Cities Resilient 2030 partnership. MCR 2030 has mobilized more than 1,500 local governments from 76 countries. Each of them has made a commitment to reduce their climate and disaster risk. Today, in particular, we will present the results of a global comparative study developed by FAO in collaboration with CIRAD and RUAF to capture the experiences and lessons learned on the impacts of multiple shocks and stresses in city region food systems, and also on innovative solutions that were adopted both as emergency measures and also to build long-term resilience. In addition, the study built an evidence base on how territorial food system approaches can help local governments with planning and investments to increase resilience. This study has been conducted in the framework of the City Region Food System Program, funded by the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture and implemented by FAO and RUAF. The program aims at supporting local governments and other stakeholders to build resilient local food systems across urban and rural areas. The City Region Food System Program is also a key pillar of the FAO Corporate Green Cities Initiative, a global initiative aiming at supporting local governments to improve health and welfare of urban and peri-urban populations through integrated management of agri-food systems and green spaces. The webinar will also feature the recently launched City Region Food System Assessment and Planning Handbook and Toolkit, a comprehensive guidance for food system stakeholders on how to build resilience in local food systems. The event will be moderated by Jess Halliday, Chief Executive from RUAF, and will foresee an initial discussion with CIRAD on the findings of the comparative study of resilience in city region food systems. Then there will be a moderated panel with the experiences from 3 cities, Tamale in Ghana, Medellin in Colombia, and Chengdu in China, that will share their experiences on how they have responded to unforeseeable shocks, building long-term resilience through innovative solutions. Finally, wrap-up and takeaway messages will be delivered by Makiko Taguchi, Agricultural Officer at FAO. Without further ado, I will leave the floor to Jess Halliday that will introduce the speakers. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much, Guido, for the introduction. So it's an honor to facilitate today's discussion with such a great group of panelists. We're going to take a question and answer approach to discussions today, so there are no PowerPoints. I'm going to ask all the panelists to please speak slowly because we do have live interpretation. That said, time is quite short, so we're relying on you to give some nice, clear, succinct answers in just a minute or two so that everybody gets a say and we have some time for questions at the end. Let's begin then by welcoming Thierry Giordano, who's researcher at CIRAD and the lead researcher of the global comparative study on lessons learned from multiple shocks and stresses in city region food systems. Thanks for joining us, Thierry.
Good afternoon, Jess.
So, Thierry, first of all, what was the purpose of this study? What was it all about?
Well, just like Guido just said, I think the purpose of the study was really to find evidence of what city could do to improve food system resilience and ensure food security and nutrition for all, even in time of crisis. Maybe at first we should define what we mean by city region food system, as it is not so obvious for everyone. A city region food system, can be defined as a complex relationship between actors and processes related to the food production, processing, marketing, consumption, in a given geographical region that includes at least one urban center or several smaller urban centers, the surrounding peri-urban areas, and the rural areas where you have exchanges of food, of course, but also people, goods, services, all across the rural-urban continuum.
Okay, so can you tell us a bit about the methodology of the study, please?
Well, as you may know, when we work on resilience, most of the time, what we do, we collect a set of data at the individual level and try to build socioeconomic indicators. And most of the time, we focus on the most vulnerable population. What we wanted to do here is to change the approach, to look beyond individual resilience and to work at the food system level. So doing all this data collection is very time consuming, very costly. So we change the approach and we say, let's look at the actors themselves, how they perceive what has happened in their food system and how resilient the food system is. So to do so, we did two things. First, we developed a global survey that gave us a broad understanding of what has happened and what is happening in different places around the world. And then we went into the deeper details where we developed case studies, 11 cities from developing, emerging, and developed countries, where together with specialists, local specialists of the food systems, we interviewed actors, we held workshops to describe what has happened at the local level over the past few years, to understand the kind of shocks, the kind of impact, the responses provided to this impact, and what was the perceptions of the outcomes by the local actors. And finally, try to identify recommendations that could help improve resilience.
Okay, so what did you find out? Perhaps just some of the main findings, please.
First of all, I would like to highlight the disconnection between what we saw at the international level and the local level. Because the study was launched just after the COVID-19 pandemic and just at the beginning of the Ukraine war. And what we saw at the international level is a recognition, first, that food security and nutrition were heavily affected by these shocks. And second, that these shocks overlaps and their impact are really compounding. But what we found out at the local level is that this kind of situation was have been there for a while. It's just a normal situation for these people. We also found out that our intuition that to go beyond the vulnerable population was right. Because with these overlapping shocks and their compounding impacts, they affect all actors, not only the most vulnerable. And more of these actors are not able to cope with these shocks. Another finding is that actors really differentiate between expected shocks, like climate change. They know this shock will happen, they might not know about when, about the magnitude, the intensity, but they know. These are expected shocks, so they can prepare. And there are other shocks, unexpected one, like the COVID. But at the local level, you have other pests and disease, for instance, related to crops that are really unexpected. And what the perception is from the actors that first, climate change is here to stay and is very important to consider. And secondly, that they must also anticipate shocks that they don't know about. And this change the mindset. You can't focus on coping with one shock. You need to cope with any kind of shocks. So we are aiming at what we call generic resilience and not specific resilience. And finally, what I would say that local city region food system actors really think that this situation, when you have shocks overlapping, compounding impact, is a new normal. And the implications of this new normal are very important. First of all, when you have all ever-coming shocks, you can only deal with emergency responses, aiming at absorbing shock. This is not enough because vulnerable people will be in this constant state of needing support because shocks are just happening over and over again. And at the same time, the number of vulnerable people keep on increasing. So you need new solutions to address these vulnerabilities and mostly the vulnerabilities of the system.
Okay, so you're painting quite a terrifying picture of this new normal. What could these solutions be then that go beyond absorbing shocks?
Well, there are solutions. I don't want to be very bleak here, but there is no easy fix. There is no one-size-fits-all solutions. Why? Because on the one hand, the context matters. Every city region food system is different from another. The structure of the food system, its features, the number of actors, everything makes it very different. So the vulnerabilities of a city region food system will be different. That's the first thing. The second one is that the scale matter. Whatever you do, whatever you look at is if you got too big a scale, then you miss the local specificities and so the solution needed that can fit the local context and be effective. If we are too small, you lose the systemic view. You lose the interdependencies between actors and processes. And thereby, by working on one part of the system, you might, at the same time, weaken another part of the system and create new vulnerabilities.
Okay, I get it. So solutions have got to be context specific and at the right scale. But you did nonetheless manage to identify some broad commonalities, I understand, between the case studies.
Indeed, we have some broad categories of action that we have identified. On the one hand, we have actions that try to target local food production and target the weaknesses of the local food production system. We identify many programs, projects, or policies trying to help farmers, for instance, to diversify their production, to use new techniques, new seeds, to change the date of planting, or to build irrigation system, for instance. But the idea is for all the CRFS, the city region food system actors, to keep a vibrant local food production a part of their resilience strategy. A second set of measures look at the other end of the food system, consumption. And here the challenge is to make sure that the food is available and affordable. Available, in most of the cases, what you do is you build storage capacity to be able to make food available in time of crisis. In terms of affordability, most of the time we identify several kinds of social safety nets, or some ways of controlling prices to make sure that people can access and afford food. And a third category of action focus on the middle, what is between the broad actions that are between consumption and production. And there, we identify a few, only, very limited number of action. What we saw is that these actions were effective. They were mostly based on systemic approach, and most of them were very transformative to the system.
So is that all there is to it then? To be transformative, you need to take a systemic approach. I'm sure you probably have a few more pointers than that.
Yeah, I think that to be transformative, you need to at least two things. The first one is obviously the capacity to change the system. And this can only be achieved through a collective action, taken in a very broad sense. When you have on one hand public policies, and on the other hand, people coming together, joining forces, mobilizing collective intelligence to innovate. That's the first thing. The second thing is to get a long-term vision of where you want to go, what your food system is going to look like in 10 to 20 years, so that all the efforts can converge in one direction. What we have seen is that COVID-19 had led to a predominance of very top-down government-led intervention, developed and implemented in a rush with little consultation, often with a lack of transparency, poor flexibility to accommodate local specificities. So we could assume that this is due to the fact that the shock was unexpected and has a global feature. But at the end, what the actor perceived that whatever the shocks, this is often very much the case, that we have this kind of top-down public policy happening. So if we want to look at tailor-made solution for the local context, you've got basically two options, according to what I said. The first one is to rely on collective action. But what we see is that there were very few identified during the workshop and interviews. And that's a bit worrying in some way. Beyond, of course, food assistance, like the food banks that try to make food available for the poor. The second option would be to rely on more local policies and mobilize local governments and ask them to step up and act according to local specificities. But here again, what we saw is that local government was seldom active in developing intervention. However, when they were very effective.
So when you interviewed them, the interviewees, the food system actors, they were talking mostly about what has been done in the past, but they also made some recommendations about what could be done better. Are these recommendations more innovative when they're talking about future measures that could be taken?
I would say yes and no. I would say yes because actors are very aware of what has been done. They understand the consequences of the different measures that have been implemented. They understand the weaknesses, the failures, the successes. And though they are able to provide very clear recommendation, very sensible recommendation around, for instance, greater participation of people in the design, the development, and implementation of solutions, try to be more transparent, make sure that you include all the food system actors in the design, try to monitor, evaluate. So they're able to provide very clever recommendations that could indeed improve the measures that have been taken. However, when it comes to the how, here there is a challenge. During the interview and workshop, we saw that it was very difficult for them to go down to the detail. For instance, who will do what? Who will take responsibility for this action? Where can we get the resources, whether they are human, financial, technical, to do what we want to do? So in fact, most of the recommendations were in reaction to what has been done. And very few new proposals have been made. So the question is whether we are really up to the challenge to this new normal situation when we consider this type of recommendation.
Okay, so I guess we have to be up to the challenge in this new normal situation. So what advice do you have to help stakeholders in city regions to move from what should be done to how they can do it?
Well, I think if you want really to be innovative and try to move forward and go beyond what we know already, you can mobilize at least 3 broad principles. The first one is to make sure that you use all the resilience capacities that you have. So basically, not to go into too much details about the academic view around resilience, but you have 5 resilience capacity. The one that you mobilize when the shock is here, which is about absorbing the shocks. Okay, so this one is very well mobilized. Then you have capacity that could be used before the shocks, what we call proactive capacities. For instance, the capacity to prevent, so to take measures to reduce existing risks, and the capacity to anticipate as well could be mobilized. And after the shock or during the shock, you can react. And this is where you use the adaptive capacity or the transformative capacity. Adaptive is about changing a bit the system here and there. Transforming is about making big changes that could lead to a new system. So my first principle will be this. Try to think about all the capacities. The second one is, how do you connect the capacities? You have probably understood that from what I said, adaptation and transformation is really the crux of the matter. Food system will have to change. City region food system will have to change. So even when you design an emergency response, when you try to absorb, you need to have in mind that this response can also help adapting and transforming the system. In the same way, when you say, I'm designing actions to transform and adapt, what I do today, in fact, in transforming and adapting, is also participating in preventing and anticipating the shocks of tomorrow. So I think the second principle, connecting this capacity, is critical. And finally, of course, apply the systemic approach at all times when you develop adaptive, transformative solutions. So when you have these three principles, I think the challenge remains to be this new normal. Take the time to think, to apply this principle in this new normal situation where food systems are permanently under pressure. So the critical issue becomes, how do you make sure that city region food system actors agree on the future of the food system? Agree on what should be happening to make the system more resilient, agree on how to transform the system, and agree on how to do it.
Thank you very much, Thierry, for that overview. Some really, really illuminating points there. Let's move on to the findings from some of the case study cities. So we can now focus a bit more on the solutions, how cities are actually working to build transformative resilience, and some of the main barriers to achieving it. So as Guido said, we are joined by representatives of the city region food systems of Medellin, Chengdu, and Tamale. So we're pleased to have with us Thomas Madrid, who's the former Secretary of Agriculture of the municipality of Girardota in Colombia, Bowen Sheng, who is the Deputy Division Director, Development Planning and Agricultural Park Division of Chengdu Municipal Bureau of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, and Philip Amoa, Research Consultant for the International Water Management Institute, IMI, based in Ghana. So let's start with Philip in Tamale. If Philip is here, do we have Philip?
Philip is here.
Hi, Philip. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So Tamale is the capital city of the northern region of Ghana, and it's a hub of administrative and commercial activities. Please, can you tell us about the typical shocks to Tamale city region food system and the vulnerabilities to those shocks?
Right. First of all, I would like to give you a brief background to set the context. Tamale is located at the heart of a food production region where you have over 2.3 million hectares of land under cultivation. And the main staple here is maize and rice. And therefore, farmers produce maize and rice, and then vegetables in the rainy season. The area is poorly endowed with water bodies, so that you have only few rivers draining the area. But over the last few years, the area has been struck with a number of shocks, like drought, erratic rainfall, excessive heat, and COVID-19. And these have actually put Tamale under a very dire consequence, the food system. In this context, people here are vulnerable because of two main reasons. One, first, poverty is on the rise, and you have more than 60% of the population living under about 1.5 or less dollars a day, and up to 16% of the food the people in there are food insecure. Second, agriculture is the main center of the economy and the society, where 75% of them are still into agriculture. And these ones have direct impact on the food system, or they have direct impact on these people because of the shocks that I have already mentioned.
Okay, so faced with these shocks and in light of these vulnerabilities, what initiatives have been put in place? And maybe you can tell us a bit about the outcomes.
Okay, it is not surprising to see year after year authorities and various actors raising concerns about these external shocks and its impact on the livelihood, especially the most vulnerable in the society, which are normally females and children. Therefore, a number of interventions have been put in place, mainly through national policies and also through NGOs or donor sponsorship to minimize the impact of these shocks. Most of the initiatives have been on production because the area is mainly agricultural production area. It also focuses on availability of food and affordability so that this one becomes consistent with the structure of the CC region food system, where you have farming as the main type of work that goes on. The interventions that have been put in place are mainly preventive, like providing buffer stock where excess food is mopped up and stored so that there will be food in the lean season for these farmers. There are other initiatives like the Resiliency in Northern Ghana, which is a program sponsored by the USAID. And this actually also looks at livelihoods and how alternative sources of revenue and food source can actually be implemented. This the Resiliency in Northern Ghana initiative actually have activities including diversification of crops. So instead of going for maize, which can be attacked by pests and diseases, they introduce something like soybean so that they have alternative source of income. And then they also introduce something like village savings, where a group of people in the community can contribute during the rainy season so that they can get some form of soft loans during the dry season when food is not available. Again, the government also came in with some other initiatives like One Village, One Dam, where most of the villages in this area were provided with small dams so that these ones can actually harvest water during the rainy season, and this one can be used during the dry season for crop production. Again, you also have One Village, One Warehouse. It's just very close to the buffer zone system where a lot of food is stored during the rainy season, or during the rainy season, and used during the lean season.
Okay, so did the interviewees in the study, did they propose any recommended approaches to designing and implementing resilience building initiatives that are aimed at government and at donors?
Yeah, you see, some of these projects or initiatives have been very successful, and these people in the community actually know, they see. But where the programs are not successful, they try to give some recommendations during the study. For example, they suggested that the initiatives that have been produced or have been suggested to address the challenge should be well coordinated. It's like each individual or each NGO or donor goes in there and tries to do its own thing, so that there will be a lot of duplication because the activities are not coordinated. So they suggested that, okay, there should be a secretariat, for example, in the local assembly, which is the local authority in the area, to actually allow all projects to be implemented first, to be registered in the assembly so they know, in order to avoid duplication. Again, some initiatives are carried out or are implemented without involving the main actors in the planning. So they suggested that, okay, in the planning and its implementation, they should involve all these or most stakeholders so that they can get their buy-in and accept all activities, and so that they can also participate. Again, farmers' capacity must be strengthened. And therefore, it is suggested that the assemblies should employ more agri-extension officers so that they can actually go into the hinterlands or to the communities to explain new methods of cultivation, etc., to these farmers so that they can actually cope with the situation. Again, they suggested that the NADMO, which is an organization that actually deals with crisis when needed, for example, the government should provide more equipment for them. Otherwise, they do things like knee-jerk reactions. When there's flooding, they don't have equipment to be able to carry people to safety areas and stuff like that. And therefore, the government should provide some of these things to the main organization that is in charge of that. Again, they suggested that more climate-proof roads should be provided. The government is providing roads to the hinterlands where the food can be brought to the city for them to use. But then the roads are not climate-friendly. And therefore, when you have a very heavy rain, parts of the roads are washed away, preventing trucks from bringing the food from the villages to the city and vice versa. And then donors, when they are actually implementing projects, should look at all the capacities. You have to mobilize all the capacities, whether it is preventive or anticipative, etc., to be able to realize all their goals. This means that not all resilient capacities are mobilized during the implementation of these particular projects. These were most of the suggestions that came from the people we interviewed.
Thank you very much, Philip. So you emphasized coordination and inclusion of actors, and I'm interested to see how this is also reflected in the other cities. Let's go now to the very different context of Medellin, or rather to the small rural municipality of Girardota within the city region of Medellin in the department of Antioquia. So Thomas, nice to have you with us today.
Hola.
Hi, Thomas. So I understand that as well as being a representative of the municipality as former Secretary of Agriculture, you are yourself a producer. You raise chickens and pigs, and you're also a university professor and a scientist in agricultural production and rural development. So as someone who wears these three hats, what have you learned about coordination of responses from recent shocks and stresses to the food system of Medellin within the city region, including from COVID-19?
Muy bien, mira, el Objetivo de Desarrollo Sostenible número 17 nos habla de las alianzas para lograr los objetivos, es decir, nos habla de unidad. Los resultados positivos obtenidos se logran con ello, con unidad. Entonces, eso nos llamó a los gobiernos locales a que teníamos que trabajar por mantener unidos y por llamar a todos los aliados, a todos los responsables ante un shock, ante una situación tan difícil como la que estaba ocurriendo en ese momento. Cuando logramos unir esos actores, consolidamos el concepto de inteligencia colectiva. Y esa inteligencia colectiva, ¿entre quién? Entre la universidad, entre el Estado, entre las instituciones, pero sobre todo logrando incluir la población, es decir, las personas del común, porque muchas de las soluciones a los problemas hacen parte de la sociedad, están en la misma sociedad y a veces no los escuchamos. Es así como se logra consolidar un concepto muy importante que es la apropiación social. En esas personas del común hay muchas soluciones que discutidas, debatidas y que con todas esas ideas se construye la respuesta ante ese shock, ante lo que viene ocurriendo, y ese fue el caso de Girardota, donde las instituciones lo que hicieron fue unirse con la comunidad, generar esa inteligencia colectiva para poder dar una respuesta. Entonces, conexión para generar unidad, y de eso nos habla el Objetivo de Desarrollo Sostenible, que nos habla de alianzas para lograr los objetivos.
Thank you. Can you give us an example of an initiative that has been based on collective intelligence, unity and teamwork between community and local government in Medellín, please?
Muy bien. En Girardota, que es un municipio del departamento de Antioquia, hacemos parte del área metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá, cercano a Medellín. Desde la gobernación de Antioquia, desde el SABA, el sistema de abastecimiento, que fue un sistema que se montó a partir de un estudio para saber cómo ocurría el abastecimiento dentro del territorio antioqueño, y además con el shock de la pandemia se entregaron directrices de poder identificar qué estaba sucediendo con esas cadenas de abastecimiento, dónde estaba ocurriendo situaciones como el acaparamiento, la especulación de precios, y donde algunas personas podrían estar aprovechándose de la situación económica para aumentar esos precios. En Girardota tuvimos una clave fundamental, y fue que nos fuimos para donde los más vulnerables, es decir, donde esos productores campesinos, realizando una caracterización de esos productores agropecuarios, de esos pequeños campesinos, identificando las brechas, esto siguiendo lineamientos desde el gobierno nacional. Esas brechas serían atendidas por el mismo municipio, procurando cerrar esas brechas. Resulta que después de cuantificar esas brechas nos dimos cuenta que uno de los principales problemas que afronta el productor primario, el productor campesino, es la comercialización. Es así como dijimos, tenemos que partir no solamente de la oferta, sino también de la demanda. Y nos fuimos a caracterizar tiendas, supermercados, legumbrerías, centros de abasto de alimentos, y nos encontramos con que ellos no estaban conectados con los productores, sino que se hacía una cadena larga donde los productos del mismo municipio iban hacia centrales, hacia ciudades principales, y luego se devolvían hacia el territorio. Es así como conjuntamente con esos establecimientos y con las personas y con los productores lanzamos algo que denominamos Boletín Plaza Intercambio Comercial, donde semana a semana, todos los lunes, funcionarios de la administración de Girardota capturan los datos lunes y martes de los precios de todos los productos, y así tienen el conocimiento acerca del abastecimiento. Y todos los miércoles se emiten los precios a través de redes sociales. Pero después nos empezaron los productores a decir, de nosotros canales de comunicación, y empezamos a enviar mensajería masiva con la información acerca de los precios, y también empezamos a leer en la radio comunitaria los precios de los productos locales, no de un territorio más grande, sino en el sitio. Esto corregido y apoyado por los mismos emprendedores, empresarios, comercializadores, y se convirtió en la estructura o la información para realizar las transacciones y los negocios por parte de los mismos productores. Si lo revisamos, esto se genera justicia social solamente por el acceso a la información que tenemos acerca de la comercialización de los productores, porque paradójicamente, a la hora de fijar un precio en un sistema de abastecimiento, al que menos se tiene en cuenta es al productor primario.
Thank you. We're running a little bit late on time, but I do have another couple of questions for you, Thomas. But perhaps if you could just keep your answers nice and short so we have time for the third panelist. We know that there will be more shocks to the food system in the future. That's something we can predict confidently in a world that is increasingly unpredictable. And it will be the most vulnerable people who will be most affected, yet again, whatever these shocks may be. Who are the vulnerable people in your area and why are they vulnerable?
Muy bien. Los shocks que hemos tenido en Colombia, no solamente la pandemia, situaciones asociadas al cambio climático, situaciones de dificultades de las materias primas que principalmente son importadas, han hecho que nos mantengamos en un shock constante y esto ha generado dificultades para esos productores. Nuestra ventaja fue identificar al más vulnerable y el más vulnerable es precisamente ese productor campesino. Esos campesinos que se convierte en una paradoja porque es el campesino quien produce alimentos, quien no logra satisfacer sus necesidades básicas, inclusive la alimentación. Muchas veces ellos mismos producen los alimentos, los venden a un costo que les pone el mercado y ellos mismos con ese costo en el que venden alimentos no alcanzan a comprar el resto de alimentos que necesitan para su familia. Entonces es importante generar unos procesos en dos vías. Uno, hacia ese campesino, hacia ese productor que se encuentre muy informado, es decir, que exista acceso a la información acerca de los precios y de esta manera podamos generar en ellos utilidades en su producción agropecuaria. Como decía ahorita, paradójicamente ellos son quienes siembran, quienes más tiempo pasan con los alimentos, ellos son los que les corresponde enfrentar los embates del clima, de las plagas, de las enfermedades y finalmente ellos no le ponen un precio a su producto, sino que se lo ponen unos intermediarios. Entonces corresponde trabajar con ellos para que ellos sean quienes logren fijar los precios de sus productos, pero también nos corresponde trabajar más en conceptos como los circuitos de cercanía, como los circuitos cortos de comercialización, como la información al consumidor acerca de dónde vienen sus productos para que ese consumidor se convierta en responsable acerca de dónde está comprando los productos y de dónde vienen esos alimentos. Los sistemas agroalimentarios, en nuestro caso, en Colombia, vienen de pequeños productores y a ellos no se les está haciendo justicia social acerca del precio del producto. Entonces, debemos trabajar en esos dos sentidos, no solamente en el productor agropecuario manteniéndolo informado, sino también en el consumidor que sepa que ese producto viene de cerca. Entonces, debemos trabajar conceptos como milla cero, circuito corto, circuito de cercanía, que finalmente se traducen en desarrollo y justicia social para un territorio.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. I'm going to move on now actually to the next speaker because we are short on time, but thank you very much for that contribution. Our next stop is Chengdu in China to learn a little bit about the systemic approach to resilience that has been taken there. Now, I've been told that be mindful of potential problems and be prepared for the worst is part of traditional Chinese philosophy. So Chengdu has developed an emergency plan during COVID, an emergency situation. Bowen, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Can you please explain to me some of the actions that are applicable in an emergency scenario like COVID and those that go further to build long-term transformative resilience? I think you're still on mute.
Oh, sorry. 谢谢主持人提问。那么成都市呢，有超过2000万的人口，在这个去年在新冠疫情的时候呢，压力很大，因为它毕竟是中国第三个人口大的城市，那么仅次于上海和北京。那么我们在各级政府要制定一些应急预案，来加强这个信息监测和市场监管，从而保证这2000多万人口在新冠疫情的情况下，粮食生产安全能够得到稳定供应。那么针对这种情况呢，因为我们毕竟有2000万的人口，成都呢每一年的这个粮食的产量大概是在230万吨左右。那么主要种植是水稻和小麦，水稻占了70%。我们在制定了一系列应急预案，因为在保供方面，这230万吨是远远不够成都市2100万人口这个每一年的这个消费的，所以说我们就会联合其他城市，比如说我们周边隔成都相近的城市，去 建一些保供基地，让他们来定期向成都来供应这种粮食或者猪肉或者牛奶和鸡蛋。那么同时呢，我们成都市呢就协调了有关部门，比如说有这个土地管理部门，有这个商务监管部门，确定了一批重点企业，包括批发市场。那么这些市场呢，就是一个我们这个保供基地，确保在应急的情况下，我们所有的东西能够送到每家每户的手上。这个尤其是发挥了我们相关电商平台的这种作用，比如说像类似于亚马逊的淘宝啊、京东啊这种电商平台，让大家可以在一天之内就买到我们想用的这些食物，买了之后一天之内就可以配送到。同时呢，我们也提升了这种仓储水平，就是把一些相关过剩的农产品储存到一些这个相关的保供基地上，确保全市的这个粮油能够供应90天，也就是3个月，蔬菜水果肉蛋奶等这种农副产品能够供应半个月。这样呢，我们这些应急管理预案呢，不仅有助于成都提升极端条件下的管理水平，也将提升我们这种现在日常的这种农产品的供应水平。谢谢。
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really struck by how comprehensive the measures are that fall under the emergency plan. So not just production and consumption, but also what's often called the missing middle of supply chains, processing, food reserves, supply chains, monitoring and evaluation. Providing safe and nutritious food for 21 million people is not an easy job. What has Chengdu you done to improve resilience on the food production side specifically?
谢谢提问啊。就像您所说的，刚才这个保障我们2000万人口的吃饭问题，是一项非常有这个挑战性的工作。那么，因为刚才主持人也谈到，这个我们在全球范围内种植粮食呢，因为粮食是一个生产的必须，所以说我们成都呢，在人均耕地只有0.7亩的情况下，0.7亩吧，就是大概是只有几平方，不到这个0.01平方公里哈。所以说，成都就要制定一系列保障粮食的措施。首先是财政资金的投入方面，因为如果说仅仅靠种粮的话，每户居民每年的纯收入大概是在300到500美元左右，这是难以维持他每一年的这个生计的。所以说我们在各级政府要给他一定的补贴，比如说我们国家和省级，包括成都市的政府，在每亩种粮的农民手中会给予这种相关的补贴，大概是在50美元左右。如果说一个种粮户超过种了50亩地的话，也就是7.5公顷，他还会再多12美金。那么这5年来啊，中央和省市财政农业投入一共投入了大约是23.5亿美元，用于发展粮食生态。这是第一方面。第二方面呢，就是说我们加强了耕地的保护，划定了一系列的基本农田，就是要求耕地上必须要每一年至少种1季粮食。那么成都呢，属于这种温带气候，亚热带温带气候哈，它的这个年平均温度大概是在10度以上，所以说比较适合种于2季水稻。但是我们就要保证这个耕地至少要种1季水稻。一般我们的种法是1季蔬菜，再种1季水稻，再种1季蔬菜，这样就保证了我们食品的这个耕地的一个有效利用和一个耕地的恢复。那么我们还确定了一个这个市域范围内的保障产业，比如说成都市的重点保障产业就是粮油、生猪、水果和这个粮油、生猪、水果和蔬菜。同时我们也确定了现在中国在制定这个种业发展计划，就要用我们的这种粮种来提供这种高产、高效和这种安全性较高的水稻，尽量降低这个农产品的这个残留，包括重金属的残留。那么同时呢，我们也是成为了中国的农业农村改革的示范区，包括在城乡融合发展上和这个农村军容和农业旅游、农产品质量安全方面，为其他的这种超大城市、特大城市提供成都经验。Thank you， 谢谢。
Thank you very much. Well, the investment in resilient production has been really significant. It's been a huge amount in financial terms, but Chengdu has taken a really holistic approach within food production. So not just growing, also processing, innovations and research, which shows how seriously the issues are being taken in China. Let's open up the floor. I think we have time maybe just for one or two questions that have been asked in the Q&A box. So let's see what we have. I'm looking also at the questions which may have been answered by my colleagues in the chat, but the speakers may have some other answers. So, okay, we have one interesting question here. If resilience is to a particular hazard or a disaster, how does generic resilience work, especially in the context of unknown hazards like COVID? Is it not that this generic resilience can worsen vulnerability by creating shocks as we try to undress these unknown shocks? Thierry, is this something you might perhaps have some thoughts on?
Yeah, I answered already in the chat, but I can make my point again. Indeed, we need to be very careful with this idea of generic resilience. We see that it is appealing because the nature of the shocks is evolving, that's for sure. And so we need to be prepared. Whether we focus only on generic resilience will help and make sure that we are ready for any kind of shocks is not sure, but probably this is the way to go, because otherwise we will miss a lot of important dimensions of the social system and not look at potential vulnerabilities that might be at the end very critical.
Okay, thank you. Is there a question for Thomas? As a small municipality, how can a small municipality be holistic when perhaps it has only the budget for social safety nets? Do you have any words of wisdom you could perhaps share on how to be creative with budgets?
Yes, ¿me pueden hacer traducción, por favor? Que no entendí completa la pregunta.
I can repeat the question. So the question is from a small municipality, how can a small municipality be holistic in its approach, looking at more transformative and different kinds of measures when the budget is usually very limited in a small municipality, and perhaps there is only enough budget for social safety nets? How is it possible to think creatively around the budget, for example?
Muy bien. Si bien somos un municipio pequeño y que tiene los recursos limitados, venimos en un proceso de metropolización. Es decir, hacemos parte de una metrópoli y estamos haciendo una transición desde un municipio que era exclusivamente productor agrícola a convertirnos en un municipio receptor que ya está siendo parte de la ciudad. Esto genera nuevos retos y entonces hace que pensemos en el abastecimiento propio dentro del territorio, dentro del municipio, antes de pensar en abastecer las grandes ciudades. Lo que está sucediendo era una triangulación de los productos alimenticios, donde primero se estaban yendo los alimentos a la gran ciudad y después, haciéndole la trazabilidad, nos dábamos cuenta de que los alimentos estaban volviendo. Esto generando dos cosas, o el sobreprecio en los productos o un inconveniente del que hablábamos ahorita, y es donde el productor no se está generando justicia social con él porque se le está pagando menos debido a que los intermediarios deben ganar un poco más. Si bien se tienen pocos recursos o reducidos recursos comparado con otros territorios, es importante realizar una gestión por esa producción sostenible dentro del mismo territorio, que el sistema agroalimentario haga que en nuestra ruralidad se produzcan primero los alimentos dentro del territorio. Y acá es importante también tener la ecuación de la innovación, traer a las universidades, a las empresas y unirla con el Estado para poder generar el valor agregado, la tecnificación, tener producción climáticamente inteligente dentro del territorio y que de esa manera nuestro territorio no dependa de otros, y sabemos que se vienen más shocks, se vienen más problemas y van a ser mucho más fáciles de afrontar si estamos unidos dentro del territorio y si tenemos cerca a la ciencia, a la tecnología, a la innovación, pero sobre todo a las personas, a la gente del común, que es finalmente quien debe apropiarse, debe generar apropiación social acerca de las soluciones que requerimos para nuestro territorio.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions that we have time for, but there are some more answers to questions that have been posted in the Q&A box, so please do explore that box. I'd like to give a big thanks to all of our panelists for answering my questions today. I'm now going to hand over to Mikiko Taguchi, Agriculture Officer at FAO. Mikiko has been involved in the City Region Food Systems Programme since 2014, and it's been a huge learning journey for everyone. So I'm looking forward to hearing Mikiko's takeaway thoughts from this presentation of the study and findings. Over to you, Mikiko.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thank you very much to all the panelists and those involved and all the attendees here today. I think when I first started getting involved in this topic of urban and peri-urban or city region food systems work, there was not a sort of a global recognition of the importance of the city region scale or even food systems, really. But now I think with the COVID pandemic and the situation in Ukraine, I think, and with the Food System Summit that the UN hosted last year, there's a clear awakening, let's say, globally on the importance of the transformation of food systems, and that we cannot continue the way we have our food systems now. And today's examples from the cities shared, I think really gives a glimpse of the different initiatives, innovations that are happening on the ground. And I think as Thierry was mentioning, what's important is the collective action and to get all the different actors involved in the process, have them joining from the beginning to share the vision for the long-term future, how the food system needs to be transformed. And I think many different ways in which different cities have tackled this came up in the discussion, but I think there are also more information and innovation that we maybe just don't know yet, that we need to also continue to keep collecting and sharing across the different people and countries and cities around the world. So I think it was a very interesting webinar, and I'm really happy that we have these people joining today. And this is one event in a series of events, and I hope more people could join in future discussions. And we also had the Food for Cities network that was posted on the chat. If you haven't joined it yet, please join us so that these discussions, exchanges can continue. And I think the time is now. We really have a right moment for us to really speak for the importance of local governments, local actors. I think the farmers as the bearing the burden of all the different kinds of shocks and being in the front line, being the most vulnerable population. I think it's really important that we lift up those in these vulnerable situations so that we can collectively bring resilience to our food systems. So with that, I would like to hand back the floor to Guido Santini, my colleague, for the final words.
Thank you so much, Makiko. Thank you for your very enlightening words. I have a couple of points just to remind to the audience. I'd like to mention that the global study on resilience to multiple shock and stresses will be published in the coming months, and it will be available in our website. So this will be notified through different communication and dissemination channels. And I also, like Makiko said, I would like to remind the audience that this webinar was part of a city region food system knowledge exchange webinar series, and there will be a next one taking place on 26th of June that will be focusing on capacity building for strengthening city region food system resilience. So without further ado, I would like to thank you everybody for having joined us today. I think let's keep this momentum and let's work together for more resilient local food systems. All the best to everybody.